Good morning. I'm John Fortier. I'm the director of the Democracy Project here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you for joining us. We're here with an excellent panel to talk about something very topical, social media and the 2018 campaign. I'm going to say a few words of background. We at BPC are doing a number of events related to elections. This one, though, and another one which we're going to pair with it, we might think of as, are we really ready to run our elections? We have a lot of talk and concern about outside influence, changes in the way we run campaigns. This today will be on social media, but we also have in October 11th coming up, a panel that deals more with the mechanics of voting. Are we ready to run our elections from an election administration perspective with representatives from DHS, secretaries of state across the country, and people from the Election Assistance Commission. So we invite you to join us for that. But today we are going to turn to this topic of social media and the 2018 campaign. Have a fantastic panel here with representatives from platforms, from political campaigns, and also from the world of academia. Let me introduce them. So Katie Harbath here next to me is the global head of, I don't have it in front of me.
Global Politics and Government Director.
And Government Director at Facebook. Where she works on issues of elections here in America, but also around the world. Tara McGowan is the CEO and co-founder of Acronym, a firm that works in the digital space on the Democratic side of the aisle. Has also been at Priorities USA previously. Nate Persily is a McClatchy professor at Stanford Law. Has worked extensively on issues of election law, political law throughout his career, but has turned really his sights towards work in the digital space, digital campaigning. And Tad Rupp is a partner at one of our leading Republican digital firms in town, Targeted Victory, and has previous experience in other campaigns, including the Romney campaign. So what I hope we do today is we talk about some of the things that are new, changes that are happening in the way we run campaigns, changes that are happening in terms of the way campaigns are able to work on platforms, changes that platforms like Facebook are making to improve the campaign. So I'm going to start with Katie. A lot has happened. 2016 was a big watershed. We're spending much more of our time in the digital world. We get more of our information. Campaigns are there more. But we also had some issues that we were thinking about, and Facebook is responding and making some changes. What are the big changes that you've been making over the last couple of years?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you all for coming and for having me. This has been, in terms of thinking about how to protect the integrity of elections on the platform, as well as supporting an informed electorate. We've been working in elections at the company. I've been there for about 7.5 years, but as you mentioned, since 2016, there's been a lot of changes that we've needed to do in order for protecting the integrity of them on our platform. And this has been a huge company-wide effort and priority. I've not seen anything this big in terms of cross-company since 2012 when we did the shift to mobile. To give you a sense of the size and scale and how much importance leadership on down are putting on this. I'm happy to dig into any of these 5 areas where we're really focusing, because each of them could easily be their own panel, but to high level kind of talk about what we're doing. One of the first things that we've been putting a lot of work into is how can we take down fake accounts. We find that when you think about people who are trying to disrupt the platform or bad actors, rarely are they going to be using their real names and their real identities in order to try to do that. Oftentimes they will be trying to use fake accounts or even having multiple accounts, which is against our terms of service. And so we find the more that we can do there, we help get to the root of many of these problems and prevent them from even starting. And so from October last year to March of this year, we have blocked over, I believe, 1.3 billion accounts from being created. Many of these blocking them at the moment of creation. So they never even get onto the site. Now, where we've even made even more strides, and is even the trickier problem to solve, is when there's rooms of people, creating accounts that try to make them seem like real people. And there we try to use machine learning and are improving our machine learning capabilities to try to be able to detect those accounts. So to give you a sense of that, last June I finally got my dad on Facebook, which took quite a while. But initially he only friended my mom, my brother, my sister, and I. He didn't post a lot. He was still kind of learning how to use the platform. On the flip side, sometimes you see these new accounts, and if they're being created with the intention of trying to spread a lot of information quickly, they're going to be friending hundreds of people right away. They're joining hundreds of groups right away. They're sharing a ton of links. And those can be indications to us that maybe it is not an authentic account. And we should either put it in a checkpoint where we ask them to verify their identity, or maybe if we're confident enough, we just take it down completely. So that's the first step that we do when we think about trying to disrupt bad actors. The second is the work we've been doing around ads transparency. So we announced in last fall, and we launched it here in May, where if anybody wants to run a political or issue ad targeting the United States, they first need to get authorized. And what I mean by that is they need to give us their ID and the last 4 digits of their social so we can verify they are who they say they are to the best of our ability. We actually use good old-fashioned snail mail to send them a postcard with a code to their home that they need to go and put that in. After that, they're authorized. They can then run ads, but they have to add the paid for by disclaimer. And those ads go into a 7-year archive where people can see the range of impressions of that ad, the range of budget spent, as well as the age, gender, and location of who saw that ad. This has helped us. I'll get to some of the disruptions we've made here over the summer from where we saw foreign entities trying to have activity on our platform. But in looking at those disruptions, one of the things we did see is that they had tried to advertise, and this ad transparency product stopped them from being able to do so because they couldn't get authorized. The third thing we're doing is how do we reduce false news? And one of the key things that we've been doing there is reducing the amount of reach automatically of URLs that are linking to websites that are mostly ad farms. Because we find most people who are trying to spread false news across the internet are doing to try to get clicks and to try to get people to go to the website where there's ads and they can make money. We also are trying to automatically reduce clickbait. So these are headlines like "woman jumps in pool, you won't believe what happens next." Those types of things, and reducing that.
What did happen?
Sorry, no. Depends on what you either eaten by an alligator, or, it depends. But then there is also work we're doing with third-party fact checkers. We initially started it with allowing them to fact check URLs, and we announced, I believe it was last week, that we were also introducing photos and videos into that as well. And if a fact checker has marked something as false, we will reduce the reach of that content and also send a notification to anybody who may have shared that content. If 2 fact checkers disagree, we don't take that action then. Now, if a bad actor gets through all of those defenses, there's still other stuff that we're doing too in terms of trying to disrupt those actors. When you think about it and trying to see if anybody from a foreign origin is doing that, one of the things we're looking at is there content of a civic nature getting a lot of reach here in the US that is coming from a page that is mostly foreign admins. That can be a flag for our threat intel and information operations teams to take a look at it. It could be a BBC article, just getting a lot of shares and getting a lot of reach, which is totally fine and okay for it to happen. Or it could be something else. And back in July and in August, we announced 2 different disruptions of pages and networks that we found that we were able to take action on that were of foreign origin, and they were not representing actually who they were in trying to do that. So they're trying to do it inauthentically. In addition to all this, we are also working across a lot of different partnerships, law enforcement, Atlantic Council. We have other third-party vendors that we work with to try to help us to share with us intelligence. And we are getting better all the time of what is the type of intelligence to share and information, and also across companies to try to get better at this. And then finally, the last thing we're also doing too is on the more civic engagement side and making sure people have the right information to vote. So this has helped people know when to register to vote, when election day is, who is on their ballot, and then after the election, who their newly elected representatives are.
Great, thank you. I think we're going to come back to these issues with Nate in a bit, but I want to turn to Tara and then Tad. You're on the front lines. You are working with campaigns, with candidates, parties, groups who want to run advertising and want to get their message out. 2016 was a huge watershed. Every 2 years, though, we progress. So can you tell us a little bit about, maybe for the general audience, what were the big things that came about in 2016? Where were we in the penetration of using digital in campaigns? And then what's on your mind now? What's happening that we should know about that is happening in this 2018 campaign?
Sure. Thanks, John, and thanks for having me, because I don't get
often invited to bipartisan events, so I'm really excited to be here. Just to start, I started Acronym, which is actually a nonprofit organization, at the beginning of last year after the 2016 election, where I had run an over $40 million digital ad campaign against Donald Trump, unsuccessfully, obviously, at Priorities USA. And so I actually started Acronym to fill a number of gaps that I sort of identified as an operative that was working in progressive campaigns and organizations to run effective programs to reach voters where they spend their time online. And one of sort of the challenges that I identified in the work that I had been doing was that a lot of the business models of consultancies and firms, of which Acronym owns one, so we do this work on both sides. We run our own programs to reach and engage voters, as well as working with progressive organizations and campaigns through our company Lockwood, was that a lot of the business models actually incentivize a lot of reach and scale of buying impressions and ads to reach voters, and are less incentivized to innovate or think about how to actually engage people in the ways that we consume information online. And so I felt that the time was right for a very different kind of model. But what I would say about 2016 is I think that there was a lot of interesting investment and innovation on both sides when it came to reaching voters online. The winner always gets a little bit more shine, I would say. I used to work on President Obama's digital team in 2012, and I benefited from that myself because we did a lot of innovation when it came to digital engagement and outreach. I do think that Trump's campaign in particular did invest more and sort of experimented a little bit more freewheelingly, if you will, and I think they had a lot less to lose at the time. I also think that some of the more innovative strategies and not okay or illegal ones that Katie is doing amazing work to confront were actually done by Russia, more so than a lot of Republican firms or strategists or campaigns. So we have been doing a lot of work to drive more innovation. The work that we do at my organization is really, really focused on how we can leverage digital organizing as well as advertising to make sure that the supporters of our candidates and our campaigns are using their voice and their platforms and their social capital where they spend their time and where they're living their lives, talking to their friends and family on text message, on Facebook, on Twitter, to really be the ambassadors and the messengers for the campaigns and candidates that we support. We find that messenger is often more valuable than message. We do a lot of testing work around that. And so I think there's a lot of innovation that's happening. I think that I would just take the headlines over Republicans sort of eating Democrats' lunch on digital with a good chunk of salt.
So one, just to follow up, if you're a voter and you're in a place that your firm or others are targeting, what might you see that's different? Or is it, you hinted at you're trying to get people more engaged and more spreading the message themselves. Is that the big thing? Or what would you say from if somebody out here who doesn't know that much about what's going on in the back, but a voter who now is gonna be online and be seeing some of your work? What's big
sure. I mean, so there's a lot more. I mean, for starters, we essentially all live our lives online and on our phones now, right? I saw a tweet yesterday that I thought it was really interesting. I think it was from Ariana Huffington, actually, but it was that we used to say BRB whenever we were on instant messenger or email or text message, and we don't say that anymore, which is really interesting because we don't leave, which I think is really interesting. And the way that we communicate is really just intrinsic to how we communicate almost verbally and in our lives, and yet for a very long time, and still persisting in a lot of campaigns and through a lot of firms, advertising put on social media and the internet looks like one-way advertising that you would put on television or you would hear on radio. But on social media, you can engage with that, and there can be a dialogue and a back and forth, and there's more competition for your attention, your views, your time. And so you really do need to create content that is resonating with people and that also matches the moment on the news feed. So things that are really relevant to what's happening in the news cycle that everyone's talking about, that there is active discussion on social media. If you are integrating your message, your candidate into those conversations, you're far more likely to get people's attention and their engagement. So I would say that's one major difference that I wish more consultants and agencies would heed.
Great. So turn to Ted, same basic question, 2016, lay the landscape for us, and then what's new, but maybe, following also up on what Tara has just said, I've heard from a lot of digital campaign people that the campaign world is changing. The old world certainly was a lot about TV, and the old set of consultants was very committed to that. And I think sometimes there's some frustration on the part of people in the new digital world. Maybe we're not moving fast enough. So maybe put it into perspective a little bit about not only what's happening in the digital world, but how we're changing from that older world.
Yeah, I mean, I think a great lesson of President Trump's campaign on the Republican side is he blew up what were a lot of false assumptions for how you have to run a winning campaign. And I think they were probably things that held back Republican campaigns in previous years. And one thing I would caution the group, echoing what was said before, was, I was in Boston as part of the Romney digital team in 2012. We took a lot of flack for how we were compared to the Obama juggernaut and how we were outperformed. And I think, the landscape is changing so fast, and the tools are changing so much, and just the way voters consume information, that to put any party and say that you're far back or you're ahead, I mean, it's really easy to catch up and ultimately leapfrog. I think that's what President Trump's campaign did, is that they came from the side. They dropped out a lot of assumptions, and I think the lessons that we take now from campaigns in 2018 from 16, I think, our speed matters. The idea of you got to throw out the approval process that slows everything down. You have to teach your designers and creative people that they have to be super quick, and the media cycle is going to change on a moment's notice. So if you're not jumping on these networks and taking advantage of it, you're missing. And that's a structural change that probably happened. Was created in a vacuum of a lack of structure on the presidential campaign, but is really sort of, I think, both people are adopting, and I think is going to be the way moving forward. I think bringing more voices to the front, to the fight. I think social are great platforms with the idea of you want to have your surrogates, put money behind more people. You want to engage your supporters. You want to arm your supporters and really mobilize them with information to share your message. To not only, so it's not just your candidate who's carrying all the weight, that other people are validating that there's an echo chamber that's really sort of growing. I think leveraging the networks, Facebook and the others, that on at least the Republican side, because these networks weren't built for political campaigns, sometimes a lot of more senior people said, we have to continue to do what we do, and first party data and being stuck behind this 30-second creative. That's how a lot of campaigns were run up until recently. And now, really trusting that these networks are changing the ways that people communicate and consume information so much that you have to create your message so that it flows on those platforms.
So turning to Nate, going back to some of the issues that Katie raised, we have been dealing with issues like disclosure, transparency, misinformation in the non-digital world for a long time. And maybe we don't have it all right, but we certainly have a body of law and regulations, and we've come to some places. The digital platforms are newer, they're less regulated, but some of these issues we're wrestling with in the same place. So do you want to take on some of those issues, raise some of those issues that Katie indicated? What should we know about this transition we're making from a world that's regulated in one way to a not so regulated place, that some of those issues are still there?
Thanks, John. So, one of the things that we see in the transition to digital in these campaigns, from a legal standpoint, right, is that in some ways the most important decisions that are regulating political communication are being made by private companies as opposed to the government, right? So that the campaign finance architecture which exists out there was basically written for a television age, right? And so if you're someone who's worked in the sort of campaign finance regulatory area for some time, the jurisprudence, the First Amendment jurisprudence, the statutory language, regulatory language, all had this sort of flavor. Like one of the problems that you were worried about is sort of captive eyeballs with television that were sort of having money was washing over them and inundating them, right? That was something seen as one of the big concerns. And that led to a certain jurisprudence which really was focused on television. And so the regimes, whether it was disclosure or other kinds of restrictions, were based on that. In the digital world, as you said, there are some regulations, say in U.S. federal law, that apply to spending money on someone else's platform. But a lot of the most important restrictions are ones that are made by the companies themselves. And they are aware of this heavy responsibility that they now have to shoulder, and that people are expecting some sort of new rules from them that almost they would never expect from the government. So that Facebook and Google and Twitter since the 2016 election have all adopted new regulations when it comes to political advertising. As Katie mentioned, you now have greater disclosure for ads that are on Facebook than you've ever had for television ads, right? So now you're able to look at not just the the individual ad that people may have seen in a particular location, but you get all this other data associated with it, as she mentioned, gender and age of the people who viewed it. One thing that's sort of interesting when you start thinking about the regulatory landscape with respect to digital is that and this is something Tad sort of mentions, that we have grown to think of an advertisement as a particular thing, right? Whether it was a 30-second ad in the television world or something on radio or on in the newspapers, right? And there's a potentially infinite variety of ways of communicating to people online, even within these different media. So for example, you as a campaigner can use machine learning to have thousands and thousands of variations on a given ad, right? And so if you're trying to develop a library of impressions and advertisements, it's almost unmanageable to try to really figure out, all right, which variation on particular ads were seen by people. And those of us who are social scientists trying to analyze the data, it's really an unprecedented challenge. This is also one of the reasons that government regulation becomes extremely difficult in this area, right? Because the technology is changing so quickly, and it's hard to really even define the problem because it's being outpaced by technological innovation. So those are some of the issues. There's obviously a lot of other unique challenges that these platforms face with respect to foreign intervention and the other issues that Katie mentioned. I'll just say one little thing on that when you talk about it more, which is it's all of the traditional categories that we say as campaign finance experts had used to classify political communication are melting away in the digital age. So what is domestic and what is foreign, right? We all think we kind of know what that is, but it's very difficult to figure out the origin of particular speech and spending. Facebook is trying to do what it can with the verification process that Katie mentioned, but when it comes to organic content or sort of quasi-paid content where it sort of comes through intermediaries and the like, it becomes extremely difficult, especially when a lot of what the foreign entities are trying to do is amplify domestic content, right? So it's very difficult to distinguish between the types of speech that is being engaged in by domestic actors and foreign actors. Who's the media in the digital age, right? When all of us can tweet and blog and do whatever we want to produce videos on YouTube and the like, there had always been a traditional exception in campaign finance law for the media. Well, who's the media in the digital age, right? And for that matter, what is political? What is news? What is advertising, right? We all thought we knew what that was when you're talking about television, where for example, which channels identify themselves as news channels, at which hours of the day there was news, but there's this kind of continuum of political information that gets merged with entertainment that's very difficult to unpackage from the other kinds of communication that you get online that these platforms are trying to deal with.
So let me turn back to you, Katie. You laid out some of the policies that Facebook is taking to improve the campaign world broadly. And I'll make this both a positive and a negative question. Maybe you can have amplify some of what you said about that, but some have raised questions that you're dealing with disinformation, and maybe the way you deal with it has an asymmetric effect. Maybe it affects one party more. You hear sometimes from the right a complaint that some of the opportunities that they might have had are not going to be there because policies are not as easily, fairly implemented as they might be. So what do you say to that?
No, I think so. At the core of it, our mission is to give people a voice, and that means across the political spectrum. And that has been something that has been sort of a northern star, if you will, for us as we've been working on a lot of this, which can get difficult when you think about this from a global standpoint and the fact that not everybody has the freedom of speech viewpoint that we come at from the U.S. When it comes to, I think one of the things that we are trying to do better on is when we take action on our site, whether that is taking content down, whether that's reducing the reach of it, et cetera, why we did that. Because oftentimes what we are actioning on, we do have community standards, and one of the things we did do earlier this year is publish more details about how we enforce on those community standards and what is or is not allowed, because we know it's a labyrinth of material of trying to figure out, and those lines keep changing too as we're thinking about things. I mean, think about the issues we had around the terror of war photo, and how do you think about nudity on the site, and how do you make those determinations when you're thinking about the scale of content that we have. But oftentimes what we're seeing is we're actually taking actions against behaviors, whether that's spam, people spamming and posting the same link over and over again in a bunch of different groups, people holding multiple different accounts, not using their real identity, behaviors like that we take down, but then we're not very clear to them about what they did. We just say, oh, you violated our community standards. And so one of the things we're trying to get better at is explaining to people about why we took the actions that we did, and that it was likely because of the behavior of that person or that entity on the platform versus what they were saying. But this continues to be it's something I've been focusing on a lot right now, of trying to help people to understand what the rules are on the platform, but at the same time not being so specific that we are telegraphing to the bad actors where the lines are and what the rules are and how they can manipulate them. It is a really difficult balance to find, and something we keep going back and forth on.
So Tara, maybe I can ask you to think about how you interact with Facebook or some of the other platforms, and maybe put it this way. The tools and the rules, right? They're giving you some new tools, and you're maybe have some new opportunities on these platforms, but also there are some changes here. How's that affecting you as somebody who's running campaigns?
Deeply.
Yes. Tell us.
I would say I have always welcomed and wish we would have more regulation. I think that the onus is on sort of all sides when it comes to these knots and these issues, in the sense that there is deep responsibility on the side of the platforms, as Katie has talked about, and they've been taking a lot of actions in Facebook in particular. One of the challenges around this with platforms self-regulating is that they're not all doing it at the same time in the same ways. So the advertisers and the organizations and the campaigns that are using these platforms to reach and engage their supporters and their communities, we have technical challenges, right? We are developing creative for these platforms. We are working on timelines. We are spending budgets down and things of that nature. And so that has become very candidly challenging in the past year, because each platform has rolled out their own regulations on their own timelines with their own nuances. I had to submit my passport and social security number to Facebook to be able to continue to advertise on the platform. That doesn't feel great either in the world of data breach. So that is challenging. I would also say that there is great onus on regulators. I would love for regulation to come from the FEC when it comes to political advertising, so the rules weren't different across all of the platforms. That would be a welcome thing. I used to joke with some of my colleagues years ago that we would love transparency and accountability in digital ads, because then we could show the competitive spending and get more budgets for reaching voters online, because that is what dictates how much money is spent on television. No one wants to be the campaign manager that didn't meet the budget of the Republican counterpart on our side when it comes to television spending. So transparency would be a welcome thing for us to play more evenly. I would also welcome campaign finance reform. That's a different topic. And then I think that there's also an onus on individuals because of the amount of information and misinformation that is out there now. And that's a much more challenging, I think, problem to solve, where people need to, also be their own advocates in understanding how to look for information and see if it's valid. So they do need to know. It's really difficult to see if a photo's been doctored. We shouldn't be able to see that with our eyes. So there is the onus on the platforms in that respect. But I also think, in this, I get very nervous and scared about the sort of how these lines get crossed now, in the sense of how we are influenced by the information that is given to us, and I think that is social media can be used for good and it can be used for evil, and we have seen both in this world. And so the more that we can do to make sure that it errs on the side of good is really important, and takes all of us, I think.
Great. So Tara, again, rules and tools, both tools that sort of are now you're able to use on platforms, maybe some interesting things, but also how the rules are impacting you.
I think First, as the Republican, it's probably not a surprise that I would have concerns about the FEC just because how they don't understand what we do, and everything is changing so much. And all you have to do is just watch the congressional hearings over the last 2 years and how senators and members of Congress and their staff don't understand how things are changing, how to do stuff, to write a law that goes out there. Absolutely. And so, yeah, and that's a huge problem. I think, to give everybody a real life example for something that happened this cycle, for a client of ours who was running for Senate, she had a launch ad, and it was a 3-minute long ad that basically outlined her bio and talked about the need to have more women in the Senate, and it was pretty straightforward. Not to pick on Twitter, but they're not here. They took the 3-minute ad, and because one portion of it, probably 3 or 4 seconds, mentioned Planned Parenthoods, somebody in Twitter who was reviewing stuff found and said that was inflammatory, sent back the ad to us as the ad placement firm and said, cut this part out and we can run the rest. Now, I don't envy any of the networks because I think that they have to, those are all part of the learning curves, and it's really hard to figure out, because I do think that there are actors probably on both sides who are trying to bait the networks into making decisions so they can then go fundraise off of it. But that to me is something that was very, very troublesome, that I can't see a network kicking back a TV ad and saying, hey, if you take this 1-2 second parts out, we'll run it on the CBS station in Charleston, West Virginia, or wherever. And so I think that to me was where kind of a big problem was, and I think the networks have done a lot better job of figuring out, because you do have somebody calling balls and strikes, and whoever that person is and wherever they are, making sure that you apply that universally is very, very important.
So Nate, I know you have a couple of big topics you might want to take on, but since we've moved towards questions of regulating misinformation and who decides what goes over the line and whether there are political implications for that, do you want to take that on? Small question.
No small.
Yeah, well, we'll get some other big questions too.
Let me say something that I think should be obvious, but that is something that when you think about the platforms and the internet has to be top of mind, which is that for the most part, they're not operating in the United States, right? Most of what they're doing is global, and they occupy a different position than any other comparable entity in the history of the world, right? In terms of the way that they are, their policies affect the free flow of information around the world. So that while it's very easy for us to say, all right, well, this is the problem because this is what's happening here, whether it's Russian disinformation or political advertising, like the policies that they adopt, while sometimes they are country specific, there are spillover effects that happen around the world. So when they think about a particular problem, they have to think about it in a global context, right? So what happens, what happens in the U.S. doesn't stay in the U.S., right? Sort of like Las Vegas. And so disinformation, right? That is a problem. I mean, that is as old as speech, and is not limited to the U.S. And the nature of the disinformation threat is different in different places, right? And so while it's comfortable to start sort of identifying and narrowing the disinformation issue in the U.S., particularly through the lens of the 2016 election, someone like Katie or her counterparts at the other platforms are thinking about, well, how does this change affect our decisions in Myanmar, or Sri Lanka, or in Cameroon, or other places, right? Where disinformation, leads to people getting killed, right? And so, and they have to think about, let alone the fact that they're dealing with different legal regimes and different technological and capacities in these different countries. So that's something that we all have to think, and that's also part of the problem that the regulators are facing in individual countries, which is that it is very difficult to adopt the kind of typical campaign finance regulatory framework where a country kind of walls itself off and regulates its democracy in a particular way, right? They have to think about the fact that these platforms are international in nature. Now, on the question of how you go after disinformation, let me start as a first cut at this. We don't really even know the scale of the problem, however we're going to define it, and that's obviously the big problem, is how do you figure out what is disinformation? So that, because when people sort of talk about disinformation, they're talking about more than the kind of caricatures of like the Pope endorses Donald Trump kind of story, right? That these, it's much more pervasive than that. And as you get farther and farther away from what is clearly identifiable false content, you then get into these extremely difficult political decisions that these platforms have to make, which often will have collateral damage on what we in the US might think is kind of protected political speech, and which often will have disparate political impacts depending on a political party. And as I said, the way that they make these decisions here in the context, say, of Russian disinformation are going to have effects around the world. Most of the, say, Russian ads or the Russian activity online was true, right? Or was neither false nor true, right? Because it was sort of inflammatory and the like. And so we talk about disinformation as if it's this particular identifiable thing, when really we're talking about a larger sort of ecosystem problem, which is extremely difficult to wrap your arms around.
They're also not all ads.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's organic content.
Yeah, and that's much harder even to regulate because there isn't as many actions taken. I mean, the volume of content is vast.
Well, that's where you got to be looking at like how they were creating their audiences, because many of them would create these pages, then they would use ads to build up the fans, and then they were pushing organic content to them. So like, how can you be fighting this at all those different levels? And I think that's one of the things too. We're barely at the start of this conversation of trying to be thinking about all this, and we're trying to move very quickly while also still trying to have these conversations of, are there lines, what are the right solutions for this, et cetera? Because even thinking about going back to the ads that the Russians ran in 2016, most of them were issue-based and they were not illegal, because they were not mentioning a candidate or anything like that. And so, hindsight's always 20/20, but that wasn't against the law. No regulator was telling us to be taking that kind of content off of our platform, which is why we also had to include issue ads. We decided to include issue ads in our political and issue ad authorization. But defining what an issue ad, because all we can get from regulators is that it should be an issue of national legislative importance. That does not give us the detail of being able to judge whether or not an ad should or should not be included in this, and we've chosen to be overly broad. People can totally disagree with that if they want, but we have found that we need to be overly broad right now. Again, going back to those disruptions that we did in July and August, I don't know if we necessarily would have caught those if we not have been overly broad in including issues. So it's absolute trade-offs right now.
So one of the areas I want to get into, which we've started to get into, is what is an ad, and that could be both. Is it issue ads? Is it candidate ads? But I think both Tad and Tara are hinting at you can pay for things and buy influence, which doesn't look traditional. It doesn't look like a video, or it doesn't look like a banner ad, which might have more corollaries in the non-digital world. What are some of the ways in which campaigns are using, I don't know, techniques, putting things up higher on people's radar screens, or using others to influence their friends, so things that maybe don't have corollaries? What are some of the things that you would say are trends that are ad-like? They're part of your campaigns, but they don't really look like traditional ads.
Well, I would say, and it's important to step back and understand again that social media platforms in particular are where people are getting news and information increasingly, where they are communicating with their friends, sharing photos with their family, really living a lot of their lives on these platforms day to day. And so the same behavior that and the same sort of strategies and tactics that have been deployed through campaigns, advocacy, electoral, political, or otherwise forever are going to translate online as well as off. So organizing communities, organizing friends and neighbors to get out the vote, to register your friends, et cetera. So that behavior will also exist online in a way that is not advertising. And so when we talk about digital organizing, it's about building a Facebook group, or having a listserv across your email, or a group text, for instance, or peer-to-peer texting, and you're able to communicate with more people and organize them around an issue, an idea, an event, a rally, et cetera. And so that can also be used in nefarious ways, as we've seen. So that when I talk about things outside of ads, there's obviously organic content, but there's also organizing, and that needs to exist for the same reason freedom of speech exists on this. This is a platform of connecting individuals, and that's what social media platforms exist for, and so that's tough.
Yeah, I think One of the things we've seen grow a lot in the last year or so is kind of the real marriage of research and digital creative for social. And that is, I think Republicans and Democrats are both good. They're very, very good researchers that provide you with these binders and these books of information, and maybe one tiny bit gets into a television ad, and that was worth it. So now the ability, for lack of a better metaphor, my company uses, it's about jabs and not haymakers. That basically being always on and always sort of these small things, and the idea of you can win by sort of death of 1,000 cuts if you're able to continue to push the narrative, have good creative that people are going to engage with, and leverage these social networks. So I think both sides are doing that, and I think they'll continue to do it, and it'll get better and better. And I just, and another real life example that sort of falls into that murky area of not necessarily right or wrong, but how do you regulate it is, my parents are college professors at a small college in West Virginia, and there was a group in the summer that was really good at using Facebook, and they were a local group, but they were backed by a Democrat super PAC by putting out these ads that there was going to be a town hall and the Republican senator was going to be in your area, so come. And I know that my parents, all their friends were coming up to them and I was like, can you believe the senator's going to come here and we'll be able to confront her on Betsy DeVos or whatever else the topic was. It was totally not true at all, right? Like, I'm sure that group sent an invite to the Senate's office, but for all of us that worked in congressional offices, how many times do you do that? And so those are the sort of types of things that it was a smart move on their part. It sort of pushed the narrative. A lot of people then said, oh, why didn't the senator show up? But it's not exactly accurate or true. How would you regulate it? There's no dollars that went behind it, and you don't know the group that's sort of behind the post.
And in fairness, it could have been a tactic to get that senator to show up, which would have been effective.
And so coming back to Facebook, one, you're probably interested in working with people who want to use your platform to influence people and monetize that. On the other hand, you're potentially worried about the effects and regulating them and stuff. So non-traditional ads, it's a big category, but what kinds of things would you say about that and how you're dealing with it?
Yeah, I think there's two areas that are really on top of mind for me that I think we're very much struggling with where to draw the lines and what's appropriate. The first is thinking about, Nate was talking about US versus global and stuff like that. Now, with our ads, with these ads transparency tools, yes, we are stopping foreign interference from happening in the election, but that means we're also stopping other foreign ads that might be legitimate. That means that foreign media, whether the BBC or The Economist or something, can't necessarily advertise into the US unless they're using a US entity. Should we allow the Israeli government to advertise into the US? What about Canada or Mexico if they want to talk about NAFTA? Because oftentimes we are in this tension right now where people want to have global conversations and have global conversations about issues, but keep their elections to just within their borders, and that is getting increasingly impossible to do. And so where do you draw those lines? And is it enough to say that it's around transparency and authenticity? And if, as long as Vladimir Putin is saying it's Vladimir Putin running an ad into the US, should that be okay? And we have not even begun to have some of those conversations. And I'll be honest, in thinking about regulation, I truly hope regulators don't just think this is like, let's just make sure ads have to have disclaimers and be done with it, because that is barely scratching the surface of how we need to be thinking about this. To the other side, I'm thinking about digital organizing. Where is it authentic and okay digital organizing? And where does it start to go into the not so okay area? Again, going back to the authenticity and the removal of fake accounts thing, I think that's one main thing. But should there be a limit of how much we should allow people to share a single URL across the platform? Where does that turn into spam versus just organizing and supporter sharing content across the platform? Do we need, because a lot of what you see bad actors doing is they're learning from legitimate campaigns in terms of the actions they are taking. And so one of the things we are trying to do is really looking at these examples and things that we are finding to try to see if we can find common themes and be trying to see if we can think about where the lines should be drawn, and then working with external folks like Nate, like Atlantic Council, IRI, NDI, others who can help us to kind of think through some of these issues and where we might, where we do want to draw that line. And we're going to make mistakes along the way. We're going to make judgment calls that then later on we're going to realize maybe we went too far or we didn't go far enough. So that's some of right now that we're just at the beginning stages of trying to think through how do we define that in terms of thinking about the amplification of content and organizing.
Great. Want to weigh in?
Well, let me just pick up a few of these themes. The first is, and we sort of said this before, what is in thinking about the categories that have been melting away, what is advertising or paid content versus what is unpaid content? Consider, for example, and this is less a problem on Facebook than I think on some other platforms, right? Now you're able to hire an army of bots or trolls, right, to communicate your message, right? The campaign finance system is completely unprepared for something like that, right? That you can create these automated accounts that can be used to target audiences on different platforms. I just learned a new word in Silicon Valley. It's called heteromation, which is, it's not, so we know what bots are, right? Which is computer code that sends these automated messages. They're more sophisticated, less sophisticated actors. Now what they're seeing is the use of bots to get individuals, actual people, to then surface certain content or to do certain things, right? So which is impossible for the platforms to distinguish, because these are actual people who are then being motivated by different types of bots in order to put up organic content, right? And so if authenticity is the line, this is actually authentic behavior by individuals, but it's motivated by these other kind of carrots and sticks that are being done by automated systems. So it's a brave new world. In thinking about like government regulation here, it is extremely challenging, right, to think about how to define the universe in a way that will have enough foresight to think about what the threats are coming down the pike. And so we, as you know, John, we published a report through BPC. Ben Ginsberg, who I see is in the audience, Bob Bauer, and I led this group of political scientists to try and come to grips with the changing campaign finance system here. And we noted the changing spending habits online versus TV and the like. But even to study this problem, right, as a social scientist, is getting increasingly difficult because the old categories that we were using are melting away.
We talked some about international. I think we talked about it in particular, the distinction between domestic and international is hard to see here. But more broadly, you do a lot of international work too. The platform, Facebook is everywhere, and they have elections other places, sometimes good elections, sometimes countries that don't have good elections. So what lessons are you learning from your work around the world, or what's different there? And maybe I'll even put a more specific tint on this. Of course, we have emerging democracies, but other democracies in Europe, established democracies, which I would say have stricter regulation of content in some ways than we do. Yeah. They don't allow polls to be published at the end. They're shorter campaigns. You're having to comply with their rules as well. So tell us some of the lessons you're learning by working on elections with the platform and other places.
Yeah, I think there's been a couple of different ways that we've been approaching this and what we've been learning, et cetera. I think first, the first thing is that the U.S. is the exception, not the rule, around the world, in a wide variety of different ways. And so one of the things we do is ahead of any election at the company, we start about 2 years to a year and a half out before their election of doing research on the ground, working with our local public policy teams, working with local civil society groups, going and talking to the political parties, et cetera, to get an understanding of what the risks they might be facing in their country. They may not be foreign interference. It may be more domestic that they are concerned about. Or it could be foreign interference, but it depends. And so you can't just pick up what we've done in one place and drop it in the other, though there are commonalities. And so what we try to do is have a suite of tools to be able to adjust and look at any different country. For instance, Kenya's election last year, very concerned about content on the platform being used to instigate offline violence. And so how do you think about and improve ways to surface content that could have hate speech in it that we then can try to make the decision of removing that from the platform or not? We made a recent policy change here earlier this year as well, is if there's content that through trusted sources we are told is a likelihood of instigating offline violence, we will then remove that from the platform. Now, there can be a lot of discussion over who's making, again, all this is judgment calls, but we're trying to think about the best ways of dealing with that. But we're learning from every election. Seeing the behaviors that people are doing, fake civic engagement's a big thing, whether it's, people having like farms or again, they just pay a bunch of people in another country to go like and share a piece of content to make it seem like it's getting a lot more engagement and is a lot more popular than it is. We took some of those disruptions in Mexico and in Brazil. Brazil's election's coming up here in 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks is the first round. We are learning a lot in terms of best ways of working with the election commissions and the government. Of learning for the German election at the end of September last year, we worked with BSI. One of the things they were worried about is the hacked Bundestag emails getting leaked right before the election. And so how do we work with them on what those rules are, given, like you said, they have different blackout periods and different rules around all this. We're struggling with this right now with rolling out the ad transparency tools. We've rolled them out in the US, in Brazil. It's the first time that campaigns can even advertise online in Brazil, and we've introduced this new tool, which is an interesting and different place to be, because we are not forcing them to do it, but it's the electoral courts that is we've provided them the tool. We require them to authorize and then add the disclaimer, but we as Facebook are not doing anything to force them to add that disclaimer. It's the electoral courts and the electoral authorities, which in all honesty is the way we'd prefer for it to be. But that's what's going to be interesting. Now we're thinking about other countries that are having elections that maybe don't have even very much campaign finance law, or are in different places. And so how do we think about that? And then again, going back to that question of what do you allow globally in the global conversation versus in those different countries. So those are a couple of different examples, but I think we're learning more how to work with different partners in governments on information sharing. We're using it to help us identify the types of activity that people might be doing and new ways that actors might be trying to disrupt the platform. Because our big thing too is we want to make sure what happened in 2016 doesn't happen again, but that we're also looking around corners. Because one of the things too, as an example, a lot of these actors are getting much better at hiding their actual location. Whether it's through VPN and other things, we're getting better at detecting that, and they're getting better at doing it. So, we still have Nigerian princes asking us for money. They're just doing it in different ways. And so we've got to be, looking at all these different elections, we're able to learn from those to keep improving our defenses.
Great. Can I just jump in one small thing here, which is just from the international, comparing the U.S. to other countries, right? What the platforms are confronting in trying to sort of wrestle with these different, not just regulations, but regimes is, so in one respect, right, the conceptions of free speech, right, in these different countries are quite different, right? And so the more libertarian view that we take in the U.S. is very different than the way that they, treat electoral speech in Europe, as you said, blackout periods and the like. On the election regulation side, at least in many of these other countries, there is one person that Katie can deal with there, right? We don't actually have, right, a national election authority here. The FEC, is an institution that's designed to fail for many different reasons. but that whether it's election security or political advertising or the like, or thinking about emerging threats, right? There really is not a single. We've got 10,000 different jurisdictions basically that are in charge in the U.S. Provides an incredibly difficult challenge to Facebook and the like. Katie mentioned or hinted at this effort that Gary King at Harvard and I are leading with this group called Social Science One, funded by the Hewlett Foundation and a coalition of other foundations to try to make social media data available to the social scientific community to really study these problems, right? Because one of the, as I said before, we don't really even know the scale of some of these problems and challenges or how the different policies are coming into place. But this is, I've been going around the world for over the summer, assembling these meetings of social scientists, really to hear what their concerns are. And each country has really different challenges. As Katie talked about, what do you do with government speech, right? Where you have these different regimes that are using the platforms in ways to communicate their political message and to affect their electoral outcomes, let alone these cross-national influences and these different speech regimes where governments are sometimes taxing the internet or taxing or holding people accountable for WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups and the like. So very different regimes that they're dealing with in different countries.
And I think one thing too that's also something that we're trying to think through the best ways to handle is what people inside a country might think is okay and what they're concerned about versus what folks outside the country think about what's happening inside that country can be two different things. And so trying to solve and think about both of those when there are disagreements over what the best approaches might be, is also an interesting challenge when most people are coming at it from within their own country. Most people are not thinking about it from a global perspective.
So I'm going to give a little heads up here because we're going to turn to you, the audience, soon here, and there will be a microphone, and we'll ask you to identify yourself and ask a question. But while that microphone is getting ready, I'm going to go down the line and just one last chance for everybody to put in something. So here's your chance to say, what's one last thing about the 2018 digital campaign that we should know? So why don't we start with Tad and work our way down?
Yeah, I mean, I think we covered a lot, right? And there's different pots. There's the global regulatory realm. There's what sort of strategists like us are doing. I think Tara will agree that even on the digital side, for both Democrats and Republicans, there's only a small sliver that are actually dealing with the tech platform placement side or are dealing with that, and that's a huge part of this. But I always come back to the fact that it's about user experience, and it's about these platforms were not built for politics. They were built and they're successful, and they've changed society because you're on your phone and you're scrolling through, and just put in perspective that we put a lot of weight to the fact that what happened in 2016 are all the hard work that we're trying to do. But when you're running Facebook and you're scrolling through and you see the anniversary pics of your college roommate and then your wacky relative, right? And then a political ad pops up, that's somewhat effective, right? And it should be, it needs to be better. But if it's not good content, if it's not part of that user experience, it's not going to sway the electorate, or it's not going to have an impact on the election. So I think the more that sort of we look at this and understand that, sure, we need to regulate, we need to take all this very, very seriously, but at the end of the day, it's the content and the user experience that's either going to swing voters and motivate them, or they're going to scroll past it and not engage with it. I think that's what really matters and will make a big impact in the next 50 days.
Nate?
I'll say just one thing that hasn't been brought up, which is how do you figure out the independent effect of these changes in the digital world as opposed to thinking about their place in the larger ecosystem, especially when you live in a world where, for example, you could have a story that appears on a website that then makes its way onto a network that then is tweeted by the president and then covered by the entire media, right? That you can't disentangle the independent effect of sort of the internet as a progenitor of whether it's polarization or disinformation or good things from the larger ecosystem in which it's operating.
Tara?
I want to try and end on a positive note before we go to questions. I think that the platforms are not going away. They're going to be part of our lives. There will continue to be more of them. And as technology evolves really quickly, our sort of approach to how we handle them and how we consume information on them, how we provide information to people on them has to evolve as well. And I think one thing that I've been optimistic about, actually, and sort of the only silver lining I could find from the results of the 2016 presidential election, is that there is more interest both from people, from citizens, as well as from the parties and elected officials in understanding how this technological world and the way that we exist within it is shifting. And it will be slow, and there will be mistakes made on all sides. But I really do think that if we can also use these platforms to push out accurate information and provide people with the information that they are looking for and compete with the false information, that will help. And that's not just about outspending Russian bots or anything of that nature. It's really just about just accepting finally that this is where the majority of people are spending their time. And so I think that is long overdue recognition, and I'm hopeful that with that we can start to actually address some more of these complicated problems.
I too want to try to end on a positive note. My goal and hope is that the pendulum has swung over here where we're all thinking about how we deal with these integrity problems. But there is a lot of good that you're seeing still in terms of people wanting to engage on these platforms. We've had 18 million connections between people and their elected representatives on Facebook through our town hall platform. We've seen that we've helped 2 million people register to vote in 2016. And so I think that what my hope is that over the next 5-10 years, we are going to find ourselves in this equilibrium where we are going to have to make sure we're doing more to stop the bad and still allowing the good. And I truly do believe we will be able to find that equilibrium again. It's just that for so long, I think we all had a very utopian view of what the internet could do and the good of it, that we hadn't been paying enough attention on mitigating the bad, and that's what we're focused on right now.
Great. Okay, as I said, we are going to turn to you in the audience, and we have some microphones, so the floor is yours. Yes, and the microphone's right there.
Hi, my name is Alex Yanevsky. I'm with the Voice of America. I have a question for Katie. You brought up the issue of the fake news, right? Mm-hmm. And as a journalist, for example, from personal experience, for months I'm trying to get in a verified account, and it's like impossible. And because, again, I'm always working in the field, and it is important to bring people facts. And the second thing is, the second question, Katie, would be so how I can solve this issue, particularly. And the second question is, based on, again, 2016 elections, and now we're approaching to new elections, what do you think the social media should do in respect to stop sharing, again, fake news and all the bad stuff that's coming with it? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of your first question, we've got a variety of ways, and I totally understand why it can be confusing in terms of requesting the verification and stuff. So let's either try to grab each other afterwards, or you can send me a DM on Twitter. I'm not hard to find on the internet, shockingly. So happy to try to look into that specifically. I think on false news, this is an area where, admittedly, I think we are only in the very beginning of trying to think through how to handle it, because as I think Nate or somebody was mentioning, it's easy to know and be able to say, if you see a headline that Tom Hanks is dead, to know that Tom Hanks isn't actually dead. That's pretty easy to verify. It gets very trickier much quicker when it comes to because a lot of the content you see, there may be some truths and then there's a falsehood. And so it's kind of a mixture. And how do you think about that? And I know back in my days when I was in the political operative world, you could have two different sides saying two opposite things and have facts that could back up both of them, but they lack context perhaps, or they're self-selecting what can back that up. So what we're trying to do is we're working with independent third-party fact checkers through the Pointers Fact-Checking Institute that are approved by them. And they're the ones helping to make the decisions of whether or not something is false, mixture, or true. We are also trying to do, if somebody has shared that content, we send them a notification that a fact checker has said something that you shared was not true. And if people still try to share it, we give them a warning sign of that. Now we get the question, why didn't you just take it down? But when you think about going back to sort of, giving everyone a voice and sort of free speech standards, we believe you have a right to say whatever you want to say. If you want to say the sun rises in the west, you can, but you don't have a right for us to amplify it. And so how can we be thinking about that? And then the final thing is, what's the right way to give people context and have them to actually be open to hearing and thinking about different viewpoints? Initially, when we started this work, we were doing this big red disputed flag. Turns out that just made people believe the news even more, and believe, especially if it reinforced their preconceived notions. And that there's been some research that shows being a little bit more subtle in terms of the different types of content and perspectives that you give them might be easier. But this is something not just us are struggling with. I think a lot of people are struggling with, of how do you get folks open to hearing different perspectives and actually changing their minds.
Actually, can I follow up with a pretty specific question? So how do these either piece of information or ads get in front of fact checkers? Do you have people just from people reporting, or you're watching out for things? Is ads different? So how do they actually get there?
We use a lot of different signals, because the other thing too is these fact checking organizations are small. So we need to try to think through how can we optimize best to scale, or to make sure we're getting the content in front of them that we think is most likely to potentially be a hoax or be false, but then also how do we amplify the work they're already doing? So there's that initial work I mentioned that we do automatically, looking for clickbait headlines, links that go to ad farms. Our machine learning has been able to classify, and look at a lot of the pieces that have been marked false or have been marked as hoaxes, to try to learn commonalities between them, to be able to surface that to the fact checkers. We do look at reports from users that mark it as false news. We also look at if a lot of people are writing in the comments, this is fake, this is false, this is not true. That can be another indication to us for it. But then we also ingest, the fact checkers are also doing their own work too. And so we also ingest the content from their websites of work they're doing and try to find that on the platform as well, and then be able to try to scale out and find it and be able to reduce the reach and give the same treatment to that content too.
Great. Okay, why don't we go right here, in the front.
I'm Kumar, and I'm unaffiliated. Now, the Indian elections are going to happen in 2019, and WhatsApp is a big part of how information is disseminated there. What are the problems you're facing there, and how is Facebook handling it?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. It's been incredibly on top of mind for us for a while at the company. WhatsApp is trickier because it's encrypted end to end in terms of the content. We recently made a change in India in terms of limiting the number of times things can be forwarded because we were running. There was a lot of horrible issues happening around information getting shared and then that turning into offline violence and people being killed. And part of that we found was coming from the forwarding of messages. We've also recently done, WhatsApp has done a series of marketing campaigns to try to help educate users in thinking about how to better identify and spot false news and maybe be a little bit more critical of what they might be seeing on something on, whether it's WhatsApp, Facebook, any of these online platforms as part of that. So we're trying to look at a wide range of different things that we can do in terms of helping to educate the public. Also, the behaviors that we might be seeing on the platform and what we can do to potentially try to help stop that from spreading false news.
And Nate, you wanted to get in on this?
One thing, because I think this is an extremely important question, and we don't think about it enough in the U.S., which is that, WhatsApp's penetration in the developing world is enormous and has been so rapid. And to some extent, we are focusing on the particular platforms that are popular in the U.S. and identifying certain problems like disinformation and polarization and the like. One of the reasons I think in some ways the internet is the problem, which is to say there are features of the internet which are amplifying these problems, is that as you move to these other forms of communication, like WhatsApp, which is peer-to-peer encrypted, right? You are seeing the same problems, and sometimes they end up being amplified, right? And they're extremely difficult for the platform, heads to then go after because we don't really even know, the extent of, say, disinformation on WhatsApp. You just get it through the groups and the like, and people then reporting it. And so the problems of anonymity, the problems of echo chambers, to the extent they exist, actually, I don't think the research shows they don't really exist as much on Facebook as people think. But the problem of viral transfer of information as opposed to mediated communication, and as you were saying, the velocity, right, of communication, all of that is amplified on these peer-to-peer platforms, and in some ways is impossible to regulate.
Okay, why don't we go over here, the second row here.
Hi, I'm Chris McKenzie with Congresswoman Sewell. I was wondering if there's one policy change that you would recommend Congress take action on in order to stop the foreign interference on our social media platforms during elections. What would that be? And that's for the whole panel.
On you. I think you and all the Hill staff could probably use a couple-day boot camp with each of the networks to understand sort of how this works and sort of ask both across, bipartisan, right? Like really Republican staff and Democrat really sort of bringing in and having an understanding how what you do and what you're trying to tackle right now will change completely in 6 months and continue to change and evolve. And so if you're trying to head it off at the problem, not just sort of at the one thing we see right now. Yep.
I understand there are solutions other than policy changes that we need to simultaneously be working on. I'm just wondering, from a policy perspective, what can Congress do?
I'll say one thing. Establish some kind of entity that is responsible for this problem, right? You start there. And look, there are real speech implications, right? You're not going to have a White House Office of Information Integrity, right, that's going to be started in the United States. But to have some body that is responsible for the problem of foreign intervention in elections is absolutely a prerequisite to whatever else would come down the pike.
And this wouldn't eliminate everything, but campaign finance reform actually would make it easier to regulate if nobody could spend money to influence elections outside of campaigns that were deeply regulated. that would help.
Which is an interesting thing, like potentially looking at what other countries have done in terms of, like, in Brazil, again, it is very limited. It is only the political parties. It's very specific people that are allowed to do advertising. And I think that would be the one. The first one that popped into my head is help me define what an issue ad is. But in all honesty, I think it is this question of who are the entities that should be allowed to be advertising and putting money behind content, not just during elections, because I think that is an easier one to solve, but throughout, at any point in time, that is influencing the political discourse and the discourse around these issues. Not an easy solve at all.
So long as democracy is preserved.
But that's right. But that's the ultimate question we're trying to, like, grapple with, and what that means. I didn't say it was going to be an easy policy solution, but that'd be one.
Okay, why don't we go here?
Good morning. I'm Manuel Vega. I'm an independent consultant. I have, given the international aspects that we have discussed here, basically the question is three questions. Does the current situation require the platform owners to have representatives in each country? So as an interface? That's question number one. And now, how do you prevent the perception that you're biased in forward or in favor of the government? And then do you exercise the same level of due diligence in foreign elections as you're trying to do in the U.S.?
So starting with your last question first, yes, we do. I mentioned some of the work, we had elections last year in France and in Germany. This year we've had major elections in Italy and Mexico. You got Brazil coming up. Very focused next year on the European Parliament elections, Nigerian elections. I'm a wealth of electoral calendar. Sorry, you get me on a roll.
If you've seen Nate's travel schedule, you should see Katie's, right? So yeah.
So yes. Your second question, your first question, do we have to have a representative in every country? We don't have a representative in every single country, but we do have somebody on our teams that are responsible for every country. And so we, from an election standpoint, we are wanting to make sure we have bare minimum contact with the election regulators in those countries, as well as potential civil society groups or others that are working in those, so that we can at least have a way for folks to flag to us if they see stuff is happening. To your second question around perceiving of working with governments, we need to work with government, but the trick is, what is the right level of that? And we always, even just from our standpoint of working with political parties and others and how to use the platform, if you're allowed to have a presence on our platform, we're giving you the same best practices and the same access to the same tools. It's then up to them in terms of how they choose to implement them and what the strategy is that they want to implement. But it is one of the reasons we publish a transparency report around the requests we've gotten from governments and how many we've actually complied with, is to try to provide more transparency around this, because there's always a balance between what a government may ask of us versus what it is that we think is right to do or to give them or to take those actions on. And so those can be incredibly nuanced, and so that's why we try to publish the transparency report so people can see as much as possible what we're doing and how we're responding.
Great. How about right in the back there?
So a question based on what Katie said, but sort of aimed at everybody regarding fact checkers, and Michael Turk, longtime listener, first-time caller. The question I have is there any concern at all with these fact check organizations that there's no arbitration process for something that gets ruled to be false? Most of these organizations don't have really any process in place or the manpower to assess any of that, and is that a concern when these giant platforms are deferring to their judgment?
I can just say yes, I think one of the ways we're trying to do this is making sure we're continually increasing the number of fact checkers that there are as part of the process, because again, if two of them disagree, then we don't do the same treatment. And you think about the recent news around Think Progress and the Weekly Standard fact checking them, none of the other fact checkers went in and gave it a different rating. And I think that was a good discussion to have around that, and as we think about these types of processes. But that's why I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of thinking about this. Of course, people can try to appeal to the fact checkers and all of that. But then are there other things we can be, as the platform, be doing on the automated side? But it's far from being a near perfect solution right now.
Can I just say one thing on fact checking? I don't know if I should say I'm a skeptic about fact checking. That's not exactly right. I mean, that's an academic. I shouldn't say that, right? But that the role and importance of fact checking is actually not, in my opinion, to identify individual stories as false or not. That even though that is what they're doing, because if the disinformation challenge is not going to be met by fact checking, just because the scale of it is so enormous, and the slice of articles that could actually be examined is so small, let alone the slice that then is going to be designated as false. And as I said before, the problem that most of us identify as disinformation is not really about these Pope endorses Donald Trump kinds of stories. However, what the role of fact-checking, in my opinion, is that it will identify sources that are repeat violators, that then highlights to the platforms to be suspicious of them going forward, and then also that factors into the algorithms and the like in terms of the priority that's given that information over others. Now that is, of course, politically fraught, because you got to continually make sure that it's not biased and the like, but we should not assume that fact-checking is going to get us out of this information problem by just identifying information online that's been proven to be false.
Nate, of course, is amplifying Pope endorses Donald Trump. I've heard that a couple times from you.
Yeah, well, that's the typical story that people put up there. But as far as I don't think anybody's vote was changed by that. Yeah.
Sorry, Ted.
I don't think this is unique to sort of what we're talking about right now with the social platforms. I mean, as a Republican, it is true that there has been a bias in the long run. I mean, this goes back. You can ask the very gray-haired consultants that we fight for and try to explain what digital is. There is I don't think it's as widespread as sort of made up to be, but that is the truth, and there are examples for it. And I think you can go and look at it. And I think that none of these, even independent fact checkers, you can go back through and are in a place to sort of combat what their own bias is. And I think the really mandate is on Tara and I to make sure that for our campaigns that we're flooding the zone with good information or counter information. It goes back to that idea that more, not necessarily transparency, but just more information out there so that you're set up to be able to refute when something's wrong, or at least tell your side of the story and let somebody decide for themselves, as opposed to a fact check organization for somebody who may or may not be behind a desk somewhere with whatever their experience or viewpoint is.
Okay. Why don't we go over here?
Hey, I'm Chase Gunner. I'm a tech reporter. You all have talked about some challenges on social media platforms that have been made, or some of the challenges that have been addressed since 2016. But you've also acknowledged we're still at the start of finding out how to handle this. And some of the most effective ways to spread information are the hardest to address and not necessarily illegal. So in the absence of new legislation or regulation, what's your level of confidence 2018 is going to be substantially different when it comes to potentially being exploited than 2016, and what still needs to be done?
I like how everyone's heads just turn this way. So I think this problem's not going away. This is we've been calling it an arms race, and I think that it is. And so I think it's going to be hard. There are many things about 2018 that are different than 2016, let alone the fact that we don't have a presidential campaign happening. And so I really think we're not going to really be able to know the effect of the changes that we as platforms or others have been making, honestly, until even start thinking about those till after 2020. And as we go into this, I think this is a very first good milestone for us to be looking at this and understanding. And there was a recent study out of Stanford that shows that we have reduced the amount of false news that is on the Facebook platform. But this is going to be a continuous thing. I think where we need to continuously be getting better is, I've talked about a lot of these policy challenges and trying to figure out where we're drawing the lines on what behavior is allowed or not. We need to get these ads transparency tools rolled out in more places to really understand the impact of those, and continually be studying and understanding the different ways that actors might be trying to exploit the exploit the platform. And so this is always going to keep being a continuous thing for us to try to figure out.
Add that on the Democratic side, at least, it's more conversational. Campaign staff and leadership and committees, this is a topic of conversation. There is more language and sort of protocol to be able to, when you see something, say something. And also bringing that to volunteers and supporters and staff of campaigns so you can more quickly identify things. I think that there needs to be more rigorous sort of education and training around what you do when you see something, because you don't also want to elevate it on the platforms. That's not usually a smart move. You want to figure out a way to raise a flag so it ends up getting fact-checked or taken down, et cetera. But that helps because I personally feel far more aware now, and actually the Facebook Transparency Archive is helpful in that, where we have a better sense at all times, I think, of what messages are moving in certain races. If you're paying attention and you're applying social listening, you can't see everything, certainly. But if something starts to gain traction, the odds are good you're going to hear about it. And the second you hear about it on local or cable news is when it's already done the damage. So you have to be able to really identify that early, and I do feel like we have gotten smarter on that and have more tools at our disposal, but again, it's not perfect.
So your question is, so to what extent will the problems that we saw in 2016 be replicated, in 2018? Are we, as a country or the platforms, going after it in the right way? So we still don't really know the scale, I think, of the problem, and all of us disagree as to what maybe the problem would be here. And I'd say what I see 2018 being is kind of a testing ground for what 2020 is going to be. I would, as consumers, I would be skeptical, or you should have caution with any news report that says, X millions of people have been exposed to some kind of disinformation. Because the truth is, on the internet, millions of people have been exposed to anything, right? The thing about the internet and researching the internet is that if you want to find any problem, right, it has happened tens of millions of times, right? But that's also because we have like trillions of interactions that are happening every day. So I think that in terms of the magnitude of the problem, however we define the problem, you're not going to see as much in 2018 as you say might have seen in 2016. But the area of focus is, all right, this is the training ground, right? The experiments are being done now to see what might be perfected for the presidential election.
I think ultimately the best defense is the voters are at least aware of this. Most voters are. I think that this is out there enough that it's nothing that Katie or any platform can do, that people have to sort of go. And the sliver of the persuasion audience, or that mobilization sort of off-year election audience that will determine these races in an off-year, I think they're probably aware of it as well. And so this idea that a funny meme that maybe gets 100 impressions is going to swing the election one way or the other, I don't think that that's going to happen. But I think more education, I think more voter engagement, and frankly, voters now have access because of their smartphones, because of these networks, to more information than ever. And as much as we've talked about that being a bad thing, it's a good thing as well.
I would also say that it would be helpful if our president wasn't undermining the news media as much and saying that you can't trust it and that it's fake news, because that is really problematic. Because then people are also retreating into their own ideological or identity-based messaging that is fed to them. And even if you have fact-checking or you have campaign finance reform, et cetera, you're still going to be able to tap into people's fears and anxieties and different things with messaging and propaganda. And so without trusted resources and by disparaging the media, I think that's really problematic.
So I know that you, the audience here in the room, and those watching us from afar, are politically engaged, and you're living lots of your lives online. So with you, I would like to thank the panel for an excellent and very educational look into what's coming up. Thank you.